Welcome to the deep dive. You're here because you want to get smart, fast, on topics that matter.
hmm
And you're looking for those aha moments without drowning in information.
We get it.
Think of us as your guides, pointing out the key landmarks in complex subjects. Today, we're putting on our instructor hats,
That's right.
and we're tackling Clause 6 from ISO IEC 27303.20 ONT.
Consider Clause 6 our syllabus for today. It's titled Planning. And honestly, it's the real strategic heart of how an organization builds its information security defenses.
The foundation.
Exactly. We're going to break it down methodically, piece by piece, just like in a classroom setting. Make sure you really grasp the core ideas.
All right, class is definitely in session. Let's dive straight into 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities.
Okay.
Now, when an organization is in this planning phase for its information security management system, the ISMS,
Yep, the ISMS.
it needs to identify potential, well, speed bumps and maybe some unexpected openings too.
That's a great way to put it. Think of planning a big trip. You consider the obvious risks, flat tires, getting lost,
Right.
but also opportunities, maybe a scenic detour or finding a quicker route. For an ISMS, these risks and opportunities, they fall into two main buckets during this initial planning.
Okay, so two main categories. What are they?
Well, the first one includes risks and opportunities that could impact the overall success of the ISMS program itself.
Big picture stuff.
Yeah, exactly. The scope of your security work, getting buy-in from top management, having the right people and tools, that sort of thing.
Can you give an example, like a risk?
Sure. If your security processes are really unclear or confusing, that's a risk, right? It hinders the ISMS actually achieving its goal.
Makes sense. And an opportunity.
An opportunity might be that having a certified ISMS gives you a commercial advantage. That's something you'd want to plan to leverage.
Okay, that's the first category. And the second one sounds more technical, maybe.
It is. The second category focuses directly on the threats to your information. So the risks related to losing confidentiality, integrity, or availability.
The classic CIA triad.
Precisely. Loss of that for the information within your ISMS scope.
Okay, so the standard must have a way of organizing how we deal with these two different types.
It does. So Clause 6.1.1, which is just called general, that deals with those broader ISMS level risks and opportunities we just talked about.
The program level ones.
Right. Then for the specific information security risks, the data threats, we have dedicated sections. 6.1.2 is information security risk assessment.
Okay.
And 6.1.3 is all about information security risk treatment.
It feels logical to separate them, but why exactly that structure? Why not just one big risk section?
That's a really good question. There are a few reasons, actually. First, structuring it this way helps the ISMS standard align better with other management systems, like ISO 9001 for quality or 14001 for environment consistency.
Okay, like a common framework.
Exactly. Second, it really emphasizes that managing those direct information security risks requires a very detailed, specific process. Assessment, treatment, its core.
Got it.
And finally, it just reinforces that risk management isn't some add-on. It's fundamental to a healthy ISMS.
And there was a little note about terminology in the standard, wasn't there? About determine versus assess.
Yes, good point. The standard basically says, look, for Clause 6, don't get too hung up on the exact words. Determine and assess regarding risks. Pretty much interchangeable here.
Okay.
Same for address and treat. They both mean taking action on the risk or opportunity. It's about the intent.
Practical approach. Okay, let's properly dig into 6.1.1 general. What's the absolute first thing an organization has to do here?
The main job is to figure out those broader ISMS-related risks and opportunities, the ones affecting the whole system.
Right.
And you don't do this in isolation. You have to consider the internal and external context, that stuff identified back in Clause 4.1.
Okay, building on previous work.
And also the needs and expectations of your interested parties, your stakeholders. That's from 4.2.
So it connects everything. And what are we trying to achieve with this general planning? What are the goals?
Well, 6.1.1 lays out a few key aims. First, make sure the ISMS actually delivers its intended outcomes, like risks are known and handled.
Protect the data, keep things running.
Exactly. Second, prevent or reduce the negative effects of those broader ISMS risks.
Proactive.
And third, and this is always key in these standards, achieve continual improvement within the ISMS itself.
Continual improvement. We hear that a lot. Can you give a practical example of a risk that might stop that?
Oh, definitely. Imagine if your ISMS documentation is a complete mess. Out of date, hard to find.
Yeah, that sounds familiar sometimes.
Right. That's a risk to continual improvement. How can you improve something if you don't even properly understand what you're currently doing? It makes finding efficiencies or fixing problems way harder.
Good example. Now, what about opportunities in this general planning bit?
Well, when a business pursues new opportunities expansion, new products that can change the context, right?
Yeah.
It might change stakeholder needs, which in turn creates new ISMS risks you need to plan for. But opportunities can also pop up within the ISMS. Maybe you find a way to streamline a security process, cut down on paperwork,
Or use some new tech.
or use new tech. Exactly. Those are internal opportunities for improvement you should grab.
So once we've identified these general risks and opportunities, what does 6.1.1 say we need to do? What's the output?
Okay, so the output needs to be clear actions.
Hmm.
You need to determine the specific actions to address the risks and grab the opportunities.
Right.
But just listing actions isn't enough. You also have to define how you'll integrate these actions into your ISMS processes. How will they become part of business as usual?
Okay. Integration.
And crucially, you need to define how you'll evaluate if these actions are actually effective. Are they working?
So identify, plan the action, figure out how to weave it in, and check if it worked.
You got it. The guidance stresses having a plan for implementation and effectiveness evaluation. And this plan needs to think about how it fits with your existing structures and supports your main information security objectives, which we'll get to in 6.2.
And you mentioned continual improvement again. How does 6.1.1 feed into that larger cycle?
It's a direct input. Clause 6.1.1 supports the overall requirement for continual improvement in Clause 10.2.
Oh, okay.
It's also linked to other bits like top management commitment in 5.1, the policy in 5.2, and all the measurement and review stuff in Clause 9. It's all part of that PDCA cycle. Plan, do, check, act.
Plan, do, check, act. Got it. It sounds like the actions decided here could be quite varied.
Oh, totally. They could be strategic, changing your whole security direction, or tactical, affecting a specific department, or just operational, changing a daily task.
Right.
They might apply only to certain sites or specific services. It really depends on the risk or opportunity.
And the standard mentions a couple of ways organizations might approach this, right? Separately or together.
Yeah, it notes you could consider these broader ISMS risks and opportunities separately from the direct information security risks we'll discuss next. Or you could take a more integrated approach and look at all types of risks together. The best way often depends on how complex your organization is and what management systems you already use.
What if you already have, say, a quality management system? Does that help?
It might. If you're already doing solid business planning for quality or environment, some of those processes might already cover parts of 6.1.1.
Right.
But you can't just assume it covers everything for information security. You absolutely have to check and verify that your existing processes meet all the specific requirements of this clause for the ISMS.
Don't assume, verify. Good advice. Okay, that's the general planning sorted. Now we zoom in with 6.1.2, Information Security Risk Assessment. This feels like where the real detective work happens for data threats.
It really is. Clause 6.1.2 mandates that you must define, consistently apply an information security risk assessment process.
Define and apply, so it's not just a one-off.
Definitely not. It needs to be a robust, repeatable procedure, part of the ISMS machinery.
What are the key components of this process? What steps do we need to take?
Okay, the standard breaks it down. First, you establish and maintain your risk acceptance criteria. Basically, how much risk are you willing to live with?
Setting the threshold.
Exactly. And alongside that, criteria for how you'll do the assessments. How will you measure consequences? How will you measure likelihood? What are the rules for combining those to get a risk level? It's like setting the scoring rules before the game starts.
Got it. Rules of engagement. What's next?
Second, consistency is key. Your process has to ensure that when you repeat assessments, the results are consistent, valid, and comparable over time. You need to trust the output.
It makes sense. You need to see if things are getting better or worse.
Precisely. Third, you actively identify the information security risks. Finding, recognizing, describing those threats to confidentiality, integrity, availability within your scope.
And assigning owners.
And assigning risk owners.
Yes.
Yes. Crucial for accountability. Someone needs to be responsible for each risk.
Okay. Identification done. Then we analyze them.
That's the next step. Analysis. Here you assess the potential consequences if a risk actually happens. Financial loss, reputation damage, legal trouble.
How bad could it be?
Exactly. And you can assess that quantitatively with numbers, like dollar amounts or qualitatively high, medium, low impact.
Okay. Consequences? And likelihood.
And likelihood. How probable is it? Again, quantitative, like a percentage, or qualitative, like rare, likely, almost certain. Then you combine consequence and likelihood to determine the overall risk level for each threat.
So we get a risk score for everything. What do we do with those scores?
That leads to the evaluation stage. You compare the risk levels you just calculated against those risk acceptance criteria you set up at the start.
Ah, comparing against the threshold.
Right. This tells you which risks are too high and need treatment. And you also prioritize them. Which ones are most urgent? Which ones need tackling first?
And I'm guessing all of this, the criteria, the analysis, the evaluation needs to be written down.
You guessed right. Clause 6.1.2 is very clear. All steps and all results of your risk assessment process must be retained as documented information.
Evidence, audit trail.
Exactly. It shows you've done your due diligence.
Let's go back to those risk acceptance criteria for a second. What should influence how an organization sets those?
Good question. The guidance says consider your specific context, size, industry, culture. Also, stakeholder requirements, and importantly, top management's appetite for risk.
How much risk are the bosses comfortable with?
Pretty much. Your criteria should align with your overall ISMS goals. You might base them on the absolute maximum risk you can tolerate, or maybe a cost-benefit view, or the potential impact on the business. And importantly, these criteria need formal sign-off from management.
Okay. And ensuring consistency and comparability over time, that sounds tricky. How do you make sure assessments are reliable?
Your methods and tools need to be detailed enough. Different people doing the assessment should reach similar conclusions. All risks should be covered appropriately. The results should be reproducible, even by an auditor.
Right.
And when you repeat the assessment later, you should be able to compare the results meaningfully to see trends. If your results are all over the place each time.
Something's wrong with the method.
Exactly. It likely indicates your assessment method isn't adequate.
Now, actually finding the risks, what are the common ways to go about identifying them?
The guidance points out two common approaches. One is event-based. You look at past incidents or anticipate future events that could cause harm. Use historical data, expert opinion.
What happened before, what might happen next?
Right. The second is the asset threat vulnerability approach. You identify your key information assets, figure out their weaknesses or vulnerabilities,
Okay.
and then consider the threats that could exploit those weaknesses.
Are those the only ways?
No, the standard says other methods are fine, as long as they give you those consistent, valid, comparable results. It does note, though, that the asset threat vulnerability way aligns nicely with ISO 27001's Annex A controls, which is helpful.
We'll get to Annex A later, I assume.
We will. A key tip here, though. Don't get totally bogged down in microscopic detail in your first risk assessment cycle. Aim for a clear, high-level picture first. Better than getting lost in the weeds and having nothing.
Good practical advice. Okay, analysis determining the risk level. How does that work again?
Analysis is about gauging the magnitude of the risk. Like I said, you look at the potential consequences and the likelihood. ISO 31000 is the general standard for risk management, and this consequence-likelihood combo is core to it.
And techniques for analysis. Qualitative, quantitative.
Both are options. Qualitative uses scales like high, medium, low. Quantitative uses actual numbers, financial costs, probabilities. And there's semi-quantitative, which puts numbers on qualitative scales.
Which is best?
Yeah. It depends. You need to consider how objective each technique is for your situation. Both the event-based and asset threat vulnerability approaches can feed into these analysis techniques, and getting experts involved usually makes the analysis much stronger.
Makes sense. Then finally, evaluation comparing against criteria. What's the ultimate output here?
The ultimate output is a decision on which risks need treatment. By comparing the analyzed risk levels to your acceptance criteria, you decide, is this risk okay as is, or do we need to do something about it?
In prioritization.
And prioritization. Based on how far above the acceptance level a risk is, you rank them for treatment. The final result should be that prioritized list of risks needing action. And you need to keep all the info from identification and analysis handy, because that informs how you'll treat them.
Perfect segue. We've assessed the risks, now we need to treat them. Clause 6.1.3, Information Security Risk Treatment. This is the action plan part.
Absolutely. This clause is all about defining and applying a process to actually do something about the unacceptable risks you've identified.
What does that process involve? Key steps.
Okay, so first, you select your risk treatment options. What approach will you take? Then, based on that, you determine the specific security controls needed.
Right.
After that, you formulate a detailed risk treatment plan. And finally, that plan needs approval from the risk owners.
And let me guess, Document everything.
You're learning. Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
All steps, all results from risk treatment must be retained as documented information, proof of your planned actions.
So those treatment options, what choices does an organization have?
The standard gives you a toolkit. You can avoid the risk, maybe stop doing the risky activity, or remove the source, like decommission a vulnerable system.
Option 1, avoid.
Option 2, take or increase the risk sometimes needed for a business opportunity, but it's a conscious choice. Option 3, modify the risk. This is common. Implement controls to reduce the likelihood or the impact, or both.
Modify, okay.
Option 4, share the risk. Transfer some of it, maybe through insurance or outsourcing agreements. And finally, Option 5, retain the risk, accept it. Usually because it's within your acceptance criteria, or the cost of treatment outweighs the benefit. But it has to be an informed decision.
Avoid, take, modify, share, retain. Okay? And for each risk-meeting treatment, we pick one or more of these.
Exactly. You weigh the options for each unacceptable risk. The aim is to bring the residual risk, the risk left after treatment, down to an acceptable level, aligning with your objectives. Often, a combination of treatments is best.
Okay, we've picked our treatment strategy. Now, determining the specific controls, how do we choose the right ones?
This is critical. The controls you choose must directly link back to the risks identified and assessed earlier. Rubbish risk assessment leads to rubbish control choices.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Precisely. Good control determination means you include everything necessary, you don't include unnecessary stuff, and the controls are designed appropriately for the risk level. Poor choices mean you're either ineffective, still vulnerable, or inefficient, spending too much money.
You need that clear link.
You absolutely need to show how your chosen controls connect back to the risk assessment and the treatment decision.
You mentioned earlier that one risk might need multiple controls. Can you give another quick example?
Sure. Think about malware risk. To treat it, you might need antivirus software, modify impact likelihood, user awareness training, modify likelihood, network segmentation, modify impact, and maybe restrictions on software installation, modify likelihood. Several controls working together.
Layers of defense. What about third parties and outsourcing? How do controls work there?
A really important point. You must consider risks from outsourced services, cloud providers, contractors, whatever.
Right.
Your controls often involve putting security requirements into contracts and SLAs, maybe audit rights. But you can't just assume the supplier's handling it. You need to consider their controls when determining your overall control set. The risk doesn't vanish just because you outsource the activity.
Shared responsibility, essentially.
Very much so. Now, the standard specifically mentions comparing your chosen controls against Annex A of ISO IEC 27001.2012. Why do that?
Yes, Annex A. The big list of controls.
Exactly. It's a comprehensive list. Comparing against it helps you double-check you haven't missed anything obvious. It might also give you ideas for better or alternative controls.
Is it mandatory to use Annex A controls?
Not exactly. Annex A is a reference list. You might need controls not in Annex A for your specific risks. And you probably won't need every single control in Annex A. But if you exclude an Annex A control, you need to justify why.
Justify exclusions. Okay, this leads us straight to the statement of applicability, the SOA, right? What exactly is that?
The SOA is a really core document. It's essentially your definitive list of required controls. It includes all controls you decided you need based on your risk treatment.
Okay.
And it references the Annex A controls. For every control on your list, you need to justify why it's included and state its implementation status.
And for the Annex A ones you didn't include?
You need justification for exclusion, too. Why is this Annex A control not needed for us?
So it documents all your control decisions. What's a good justification for including a control?
The justification should clearly link it back to risk treatment. Explain how this control modifies a specific risk, reduces likelihood, reduces impact, helping you meet your acceptance criteria.
And justification for excluding an Annex A control.
Could be several reasons. Maybe it's just not needed for any of your risk treatments, or it's not applicable to your scope like physical security controls for a building you don't occupy.
Right.
Or maybe the risk it addresses is already covered effectively by a different custom control you've designed.
Okay. The guidance suggests a table for the SOA.
Yeah, a table works really well. List all Annex A controls plus any custom ones. Columns for is it necessary. Justification include implementation status.
Simple enough.
You could add optional columns too. More detail on implementation, links to procedures, maybe even who operates the control.
Useful extras. Okay, control sorted, SOA drafted. Now the risk treatment plan, what goes in that?
The standard's flexible on format, but the plan needs to document. for each risk being treated, the chosen treatment options, the necessary controls, and their implementation status.
Essential info. What else is helpful?
Definitely helpful to include the risk owner and the expected residual risk level after treatment.
Yeah.
If actions are needed to implement controls, the plan becomes an action plan. Who does what by when?
Responsibilities and deadlines, like a project plan.
Pretty much. A table format works well here too.
Yeah.
List the risks, then the controls for each, columns for responsible person, target date, how it should work, target status.
Can you walk us through that laptop example again, tying it all together? Risk, treatment, ASOA, plan.
Okay. Risk, lost stolen laptop with sensitive data, assessed as high risk. Treatment option, modify likelihood and consequences.
Controls.
Controls determine laptop security policy, likelihood, user training likelihood, disk encryption, consequences, remote wipe capability, consequences. So ACA lists these controls, justifies them, reduces risk of data breach from lost device, notes implementation status, e.g. policy implemented, encryption rollout 75% complete, references relevant Annex A controls perhaps.
And the treatment plan.
Treatment plan lists the risk, shows the controls, assigns responsibility. IT implements encryption by Q3, HR delivers training by Q2, specifies expected outcome, residual risk, medium-low.
That connects the dots nicely. Final step in 6.1.3, risk owner approval. Why is that formal step needed?
Because the risk owner is accountable. Their approval confirms that the proposed treatment plan is acceptable, ideally bringing the risk within the agreed criteria.
What if it doesn't quite get there?
Then there needs to be a documented reason, a formal acceptance of that remaining residual risk, maybe with management oversight. You need to record that the owner accepts the residual risk and that management approves the plan. You could even add columns to your treatment plan for sign-offs.
Accountability and transparency. Okay, huge section covered risk assessment and treatment. Now, the second main part of Clause 6. 6.2, information security objectives and planning to achieve them. What's the focus shift here?
Clause 6.2 moves us from dealing with risks to setting positive goals. It's about establishing specific, measurable information security objectives and then planning how you'll actually achieve them.
Setting targets.
Exactly, and these need to be set at relevant functions and levels throughout the organization, not just high-level stuff.
Why are objectives so important? What do they do for the ISMS?
They're vital for turning strategy into action. They translate the high-level aims in your security policy into tangible targets.
Make the policy real.
Right.
Right.
And they give you a way to measure the performance of your controls and processes. Are we actually achieving what the policy says we should?
How should these objectives be set up and shared?
The organization needs to plan them, establish them clearly, and communicate them effectively to everyone who needs to know.
Okay.
Importantly, any information security objective has to meet the criteria in 6.2, even if it's already mentioned in the policy. You also need to consider your context, 4.1, and stakeholder needs, 4.2, when setting them.
And risk assessment results feed in too.
Yes, the results from your risk assessment and treatment, 6.1, are crucial inputs. They help ensure your objectives stay relevant and realistic based on the actual risks you face.
Do objectives also feed back into risk assessment?
They do. Your objectives can influence your risk acceptance criteria. What level of risk is acceptable depends partly on what security goals you're trying to achieve. It's interconnected.
What are the must-haves for these objectives? What requirements do they need to meet?
Okay, 6.2 lists several key requirements. They must be consistent with the information security policy.
Alignment.
They must be measurable if practicable.
Measurable.
They need to consider applicable security requirements and the results of risk assessment and treatment.
Relevant.
They must be communicated.
Known.
And updated as appropriate.
Current.
And of course, you need to keep documented information about them.
That phrase, measurable if practicable again. So not always easy to quantify.
Sometimes it's tricky, yes. But you should always try for measurability. It makes tracking progress so much easier. If you can't use a hard number, you should at least define clearly how you'll know if it's been achieved, qualitatively or quantitatively. Describe the success criteria.
Okay, we have objectives. Now, the plan to achieve them. What needs to be in that plan?
Clause 6.2 is specific here. For each objective, your plan needs to define what will be done, the actions. What resources are required, people, budget, tools.
Resources.
Who will be responsible?
Who?
When will it be completed? Timeline.
When?
And how will the results be evaluated?
How evaluated? What resources? Who, when, how evaluated? Got it.
Pretty comprehensive.
Does this planning framework apply elsewhere in the ISMS?
Yes, it's a generic requirement. It applies to other plans too. Improvement plans, the risk treatment plan we just discussed, plans for training, awareness, communication, audits, reviews,
Right.
any plan aimed at achieving a goal within the ISMS.
How does the guidance suggest setting these objectives effectively?
It suggests your main security policy should either state the objectives directly or provide a framework for setting them. It also reiterates objectives can be expressed in different measurable ways: numerical targets, performance levels, compliance rates, completion of actions, meeting risk criteria.
Lots of options for measurability. And ensuring they meet those requirements: consistency, measurability, relevance.
The guidance clarifies. Consistency means they align with the policy's intent. Measurability means defining success criteria, even if not purely numeric. Relevance means they link to security needs and use risk assessment results as input.
And communication and updates?
Communicate them to relevant internal folks, maybe external ones if needed. Update them when things change, new threats, new business goals, and communicate the updates too. Keep them alive.
And the planning documentation itself, what should that look like?
The plans should clearly show those 5 elements: what, resources, who, when, how evaluated. The guidance notes organizations can use various methods: one big plan, separate project plans, actions embedded in other plans. The key is that the resulting plans cover those essential planning elements.
What sort of documentation might we keep?
The plans themselves, obviously, but also records showing the actions taken, resources used, responsibilities assigned, progress against deadlines, evaluation results, the requirements behind the objectives, anything that demonstrates you're actively managing the achievement of your objectives.
Wow. Okay. That was a proper deep dive into Clause 6 of ISO IEC 273-350-320-32017. We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. We've gone through 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. The general part, the detailed risk assessment, the crucial risk treatment.
And then 6.2, setting those information security objectives and planning how to actually hit them.
It really shows how Clause 6 forms the strategic bedrock for an effective ISMS, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a blueprint. Understanding these planning elements gives you, the listener, real insight into how organizations can proactively manage their security posture.
Exactly. It's about that structured, thoughtful approach, identifying threats, analyzing them, treating them strategically, and setting clear goals for protection.
It makes you think how these ideas play out differently in, say, a small tech startup versus a huge financial institution. But the core principles remain vital.
The principles are universal. Even if the application varies hugely, that plan-do-check-act cycle is key.
So for everyone listening, perhaps reflect on your own context. Where do you see these planning elements in action? Or where might they be needed?
It's a valuable exercise, and maybe there are other clauses or related areas like specific risk frameworks you'd like us to tackle in future deep dives.
Definitely let us know. Your feedback and suggestions really help shape these sessions.
They absolutely do. We want these to be as useful and clear as possible for you.
Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration of ISO IC 27073.2017, Clause 6. We hope it's given you some valuable insights.
Thanks for tuning in.
Until the next deep dive.